What's up, guys? What's up? Okay. Observance of the law. Okay. Observance of the law. Alexander the Great had a dominant passion as a young man, an intense dislike for his father, King Philip of Macedonia. He hated Philip's cunning, cautious style of ruling, his bombastic speeches, his drinking and whoring, and his love of wrestling and of other wastes of time. Alexander knew he had to make himself the very opposite of his domineering father. He would force himself to be bold and reckless. He would control his tongue and be a man of few words, and he would not lose precious time in pursuit of pleasures that brought no glory. Alexander also resented the fact that Philip had conquered most of Greece. My father will go on conquering till there is nothing extraordinary left for me to do, he once explained. While other sons of powerful men were content to inherit wealth and live live a life of leisure, Alexander wanted only to outdo his father, to obliterate Philip's name from history by surpassing his accomplishments. Alexander is to show others how superior he was to his father. A Thessalian horse dealer once brought a prize horse named Bucephalus to sell to Philip. None of the king's grooms could go near the horse. It was far too savage, and Philip berated the merchant for bringing him such a useless beast. Watching the whole affair, Alexander scowled and commented, "What a horse they are losing for what of skill and sprint to manage him." When he had said this several times, Philip had finally had enough and challenged him to take on the horse. He called the merchant back, secretly hoping his son would have a nasty fall and learn a bitter lesson. But Alexander was the one to teach the lesson. Not only did he mount Bucephalus, he managed to ride him at full gallop, taming the horse that would later carry him all the way to India. The courtiers applauded widely, but Philip seethed inside, seeing not a son but a rival to his power. Alexander's defiance of his father grew bolder. One day the two men had a heated argument before the entire court, and Philip drew his sword as if to strike his son. Having drunk too much wine, however, the king stumbled. Alexander pointed at his father and jeered, "Men of Macedonia, see there the man who is preparing to pass from Europe to Asia. He cannot pass from one table to another without falling." When Alexander was 18, a disgruntled courtier murdered Philip. As word of the regicide spread through Greece, after city rose up in rebellion against their Macedonian ruler. Philip's advisors counseled Alexander, now the king, to proceed cautiously, to do as Philip had done and conquer through cunning. But Alexander would do things his way. He marched to the furthest reaches of the kingdom, surpassed the rebellious towns, and reunited the empire with brutal efficiency. As a young rebel grows older, his struggle against the father often wanes, and he gradually comes to resemble the very man he had wanted to defy. But Alexander's loathing of his father did not end with Philip's death. Once he had consolidated Greece, he set his eyes on Persia, the prize that had eluded his father, who had dreamed of conquering Asia. If he defeated the Persians, Alexander would finally surpass Philip in glory and fame. Alexander crossed into Asia with an army of 35,000 to face a Persian force numbering over 1,000,000. Before engaging the Persian battle, they passed through the town of Gordium. Here in the town's main temple there stood an ancient chariot tied with cords made of the rind of the cornel tree. Legend had it that any man who could undo these cords, the Gordian knot, would rule the world. Many had tried to untie the enormous and intricate knot, but none had succeeded. Alexander, seeing he could not possibly untie the knot with his bare hands, took out his sword and with one slash cut it in half. This symbolic gesture showed the world that he would not do as others, but would blaze his own path. Against astounding odds, Alexander conquered the Persians. Most expected him to stop there. It was a great triumph, enough to secure his fame for eternity, but Alexander had the same relationship to his own deeds as he had to his father. His conquest of Persia represented the past, and he wanted never to rest on past triumphs and to allow the past to outshine the present. He moved on to India, extending his empire beyond all known limits. Only his disgruntled and weary soldiers prevented him from going farther. Interpretation. Alexander represents an extremely uncommon type in history, the son of a famous and successful man who managed to surpass the father in glory and power. The reason this type is uncommon is simple. The father most often manages to amass his fortune, his kingdom, because he begins with little or nothing. A desperate urge impels him to succeed. He has nothing to lose by cunning and impetuousness, and has no famous father of his own to compete against. This kind of man has reason to believe in himself, to believe that his way of doing things is the best, because after all, it worked for him. When a man like this has a son, he becomes domineering and oppressive, opposing his lessons on the son, who is starting off life in circumstances totally different from those in which the father himself began. Instead of allowing the son to go in a new direction, the father will try to put him in his own shoes, perhaps secretly wishing the boy will fail. As Philip have wanted to see Alexander thrown from Bucephalus' father, envy their son's youth and vigor after all, and their desire is to control and dominate. The sons of such men tend to become cowed and cautious, terrified of losing what their fathers have gained. The son will never step out of his father's shadows unless he adopts the ruthless strategy of Alexander, disparaging the past, create your own kingdom, put the father in the shadows instead of letting him do the same to you. If you cannot materially start from ground zero, it would be foolish to renounce an inheritance. You can at least begin from ground zero psychologically by throwing off the weight of the past and charting a new direction. Alexander instinctively recognized that privilege of birth are impediments to power. Be merciless with the past, then, not only with your father and his father, but with your own earlier achievements. Only the weak rest on their laurels and dote on past triumphs. In the game of power, there is never time to rest. Keys to power. In many ancient kingdoms, for example, Bengal and Sumatra, after the king had ruled for several years, his subjects would execute him. This was done partly as a result of renewal, but also to prevent him from growing too powerful, for the king would generally try to establish a permanent order at the expense of other families and of his own sons. Instead of protecting the tribe and leading it in times of war, he would attempt to dominate it, and so he would be beaten to death or executed in an elaborate ritual. Now that he was no longer one for his honor to go to his head, he could be worshipped as a god. Meanwhile, the field had been cleared for a new and youthful order to establish itself. The ambient hostile attitude towards the king or father figure also finds expression in legends of heroes who do not know their father. Moses, the archetypical man of power who was found abandoned among the bulrushes and never knew his parents. Without a father to compete with him or limit him, he could attain the heights of power. Hercules had no earthly father. He was the son of the god Zeus. Later in his life, Alexander the Great spread the story that the god Jupiter, a man, had sired him, not Philip of Macedon. Legends and rituals like this eliminate the human father because he symbolizes the destructive power of the past. The past prevents the young hero from creating his own world. He must do as his father did, even after that father is dead or powerless. The hero must bow and scrape before his predecessors and yield to tradition and precedent. What had successes in the past must be carried over to the present, even though circumstances have greatly changed. The past also weighs the hero down with an inheritance that he is terrified of losing, making him timid and cautious. Power depends on the ability to fill a void, to occupy a field that has been cleared of the dead weight of the past. Not only after the father figure has been properly done away with will you have the necessary space to create and establish a new order. There are several strategies you can adopt to accomplish this. Variation on the execution of the king that disguises the variance of the impulse by channeling it in socially acceptable forms. Perhaps the simplest ways to escape the shadow of the past is simply to belittle it, playing on the timeless antagonism between the generations, starting of the young against the old. For this you need a convenient order convenient older figure to pillory Mao Zedong, confronting a culture that fiercely resisted the charge, played on the suppressed resentment against the overbearing presence of the vulnerable. Confucius in Chinese culture, John F. Kennedy knew the dangers of getting lost in the past. He radically distinguished his presidency from that of his predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and also from the preceding decade, the 1950s, which Eisenhower personified. Kennedy, for instance, would not play the dull and fatherly game of golf, a symbol of retirement and privilege, and Eisenhower's passion. Instead, he played football on the White House lawn. In every aspect, his administration represented vigor and youth, as opposed to the stodgy Eisenhower. Kennedy had discovered an old truth: the young are easily set against the old, since they yearn to make their own place in the world and resent the shadow of their fathers. The distance you establish from your predecessor often demands some symbolism, a way of advertising yourself publicly. Louis, for example, created such symbolism when he rejected the traditional palace of the French kings and built his own palace of Versailles. King Philip II of Spain did the same when he created his center of power, the palace of El Escorial, in what was then the middle of nowhere. But Louis carried the game further. He would not be a king like his father or earlier ancestors. He would not wear a crown or carry a scepter or sit on a throne. He would establish a new kind of imposing authority with symbols and rituals of his own. Louis made his ancestral rituals into laughable relics of the past. Follow his example. Never let yourself be as following your predecessor's path. If you do, you will never surpass him. You must physically demonstrate your difference by establishing a style and symbolism that sets you apart. The Roman Emperor Augustus and successor to Julius Caesar understood this thoroughly. Caesar had been a great general, a theatrical figure whose spectacles kept the Romans entertained, an international missionary seduced by the charms of Cleopatra, a larger-than-life figure. So Augustus, despite his own theatrical tendencies, competed with Caesar not by trying to outdo him but by differentiating himself from him. He based his power on a return to Roman simplicity and austerity of both style and substance. Against the memory of Caesar's sweeping presence, Augustus opened a quiet and manly dignity. Okay, that's it, guys. So, bye.